Do you know what the Renaissance was? Do you understand what the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages were? Do you know what was the story between the transition between these two periods? Do you understand why all these parts of history, of our history, of Western history, are still important today? I will try to answer some of these questions in a way that will not involve complicated names or dates, but rather ideas, so you can finally remember what these important events and periods in our history were about, and not worry about trying to understand them every single time and being confused every time you hear these kind of terms. So, very, very briefly, the Renaissance was a return to classical values. By classical, we mean Greco-Roman. Greco-Roman is a word referring to the Greek and Roman civilizations of antiquity. Why did the Renaissance return to these values? We always say that Renaissance means rebirth. Rebirth of what exactly? And what was happening before this rebirth? So what was happening before this rebirth was the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, a long period in European history where a lot of things that we would now consider dangerous and fundamentalist and extremist were taking place. Those were the years where a lot of religious wars and a lot of religious fanaticism happened in Europe. Those were the years where a lot of people died because of their beliefs and because of intolerance about the interpretation of religious beliefs. Those years marked tremendous bloodshed and wars in Europe, and are associated, and they're called Dark Ages. They were not completely dark, of course. There was great culture and civilization happening during those times, but there was also a lot of, as I said before, extremism, intolerance, fundamentalism, death by diseases also, and by wars, and a lot of pain. It was a very painful part of the history of Europe. So at some point, there was a transition. There was a transition from the Dark Ages towards the Renaissance. This did not happen overnight, and it did not happen in all. Look how beautiful this is behind me. This is Renaissance architecture. So it did not happen all at the same time, and not happen with the same speed in every country in Europe. The Renaissance had different speeds at different countries in Europe. You may be familiar with the idea of Italian Renaissance, which was particularly powerful and illuminating, and you may be familiar with Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance man par excellence. So, rebirth, as we said, Renaissance. What does it mean, and what was reborn? As I said before, what was reborn was the spirit of the Greco-Roman antiquity. What was the spirit of Greco-Roman antiquity? That was the spirit of humanity, the spirit that man is the measure of all things. That does not mean that people stop believing in God, but it means that they elevated man as well. The way to simply understand this is that during the Dark Ages, man was considered a miserable, sinful worm who was often punished by God or by priests or by diseases because of his sinful, horrible nature. People did extreme things like flagellate themselves. Flagellate themselves is, I feel I'm such a miserable sinner that I take a whip in my hand and I walk around whipping my back with this whip until I bleed, and I live like that to atone for my sins. That kind of fundamentalist extremism started evaporating with the Renaissance, who saw man as the measure of things and a potential, and humanity being also beautiful, resurrecting, as I said before, the values of the Greco-Roman past. So this new way of seeing the world, of seeing man, nature, and God, fueled an incredible period in European civilization that we still feel today. In some ways, we're still children of the Renaissance. And I hope we will continue to be, because as we see in many, many countries right now, a lot of fundamentalism, values, and ideas are popping up all the time. So in Renaissance, the values of the Renaissance express themselves not only in religious thinking, but notably in artistic thinking. What does that mean? That means that suddenly men became the measure of the different arts. So all of a sudden we see men very often naked and very often with beautiful bodies, like in the old Greco-Roman statues, figuring in art, in sculpture and in painting. So you may know Michelangelo's David in Florence, for example. This is a classic Renaissance statue where the human body is actually glorified in all its nudity. In architecture, this also played out incredibly. I've been walking around the terrace of a Renaissance church, of a basilica, a Renaissance basilica. And what happened in this particular period is that the forms of Greco-Roman architecture were brought out and employed. That means that people started building buildings that looked like what they thought ancient Greek and Roman buildings looked like. Look at that, for example. Okay, this is a building that mimics the ideas of Greco-Roman architecture. That means, what are these ideas? The need for light. A lot of light comes through. Symmetry is extremely important. You see how symmetrical all those columns are. Okay, you see there's a round window here, there's another round window here. Repetition, the colonnade going both this way and this way, completely symmetrical and identical on both sides. Okay, and perhaps most importantly, the idea of measure. The idea of proportion, the idea that things can be proportionately created to give harmony, which means that the ratio between the height of this column and the space between this column and the other column was very, very carefully considered in order to create a harmonious equilibrium. The repetition of these columns, how close they are to each other, what the form of these vaults are and these domes, were all very carefully considered with the idea of men and pleasing men, pleasing the eye of man and the aesthetic capabilities of man. So through this pleasure and satisfaction, man can reach higher out from himself towards the idea of God. But this was a different God than before, even though we're always talking about the Christian God. This was a God who was not looking to punish man as much or to destroy him, but more to reward him for his good deeds. So a lot of this art was centered around churches, like the church that I'm walking through right now, and it was viewed now that these gifts of art towards the people, the faithful, and towards the God would elevate man. So there was, instead of concentrating on how sinful, horrible, and miserable, what a worm and a shit man was, all of a sudden we're seeing the possibility that men can actually be very special and wonderful. Always with the grand example of Leonardo da Vinci, who was the universal man. A master of so many arts and professions. Behind me, and if I play with the camera, you can sometimes see me and sometimes in darkness. Let me see if I can press here perhaps. There we go. So here you see another building across from me. Look at the amazing symmetry of this building, okay? You see the columns and you see that oops, it illuminated again. In any case, you get the point. You have three arches, the building is completely symmetrical through an arch, and there's a harmony of form and function. The portico, the colonnade at the bottom allows people to escape the hot sun of the summer, and simulates ancient forms and ancient buildings from the Greek and Roman history. So that is the Renaissance, and as I said before, we're all children of the Renaissance. We live in a world that has taken a lot of the values, the Western world. I'm always talking about the Western world. That doesn't mean the Eastern world does not have humanistic value at all. I'm just following right now the Western civilization. So we still live in the world of inquiry also, not just aesthetics, but also inquiry. In the Renaissance, people were no longer scared to make scientific discoveries like they were in the Middle Ages, and they dared to study the world with scientific instruments and scientific knowledge and understand how things worked without being terrified or by being much less terrified that the church would grab them and kill them because the research, the scientific research, was contradictory to what church doctrine was saying. You look at the beautiful buildings all around me. So these kind of cities, I'm now in the Veneto in northern Italy, near Venice, and this is a classic Renaissance city, one of the most wonderful there are. So scientific inquiry flourished during the Renaissance and continued to our day, and during the Renaissance, and you had people like Leonardo da Vinci again, Galileo, who studied the planets and had new ideas about how the world was organized and the universe. We still live with these values, and I hope we will continue to live with these values. So that was, and I will stop now. So that was my little lecture, if you will, on understanding what the Renaissance was, what the Middle Ages were, and how the two related to each other. I hope you agree with me that it's much more fun to be living in the Renaissance than in the Middle or Dark Ages, and let's hope together that we won't return to those. Noma Dimitri, happy trails.